It's weird how in software, everyone acts like they know what a design pattern is until you ask them to define it without using the word pattern. Then the room gets quiet, because design patterns aren't just a topic. They're a culture, they're a badge, a filter, a religion, a spell book. And if you've ever opened a simple PR at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday and fell into the maze of factories and wrappers, you've already met the darker side of patterns. But here's the twist. That maze might not be bad engineering. It might be something older, something deeper, something that started in architecture, but real architecture before software stole the term, which does raise the question, what really is a design pattern? Is it a reusable solution? Is it a best practice, a structure, a rule, a recipe, a diagram, a vibe? Or is it something far more unsettling? A workaround that got promoted to truth? Because the moment you investigate patterns seriously, you hit a problem pretty fast. There isn't just one definition. I've heard multiple definitions. They're all stacked on top of each other like geological layers, and each layer changes how you see what a pattern really is. Let's dive in. Definition 1, a reusable solution to a recurring problem. This is the definition everyone repeats because it's clean and safe. It's a design pattern is a reusable template for solving commonly occurring problems in software design. Not copy-paste code, but a general solution you adapt to your situation. That sounds reasonable, almost too reasonable. Because if patterns are just reusable solutions, why do some of them feel like you're building a temple for a mosquito? Why does a simple solution sometimes create 10 new files? Why does it seem like it makes change harder instead of easier? And why does it feel like the pattern is being used even when no one really remembers the original problem? That's where the story gets really interesting, because that popular definition is not where patterns begin. A pattern is a named relationship between a problem and a solution inside a language. In 1977, the concept was described by architect Christopher Alexander in a pattern language. Alexander's idea wasn't, here's a neat trick you can reuse. It was more dangerous than that. He was trying to create a language of building. That's pretty deep. Not just rules, not just blueprints, an actual language of building. This means patterns were not isolated to solutions. They were connected moves in a system meant to be combined like words into sentences. It sounds abstract, but it does matter, because the moment software stole patterns, it changed the entire game. Software patterns did not just become solutions. They became entire status symbols, but we're not there yet, because Alexander's version contains a detail that software engineers often ignore. Patterns exist because of conflicting forces, like make a room sunny, but don't let it overheat. It's like a stable resolution of forces pulling in opposite directions, which is not the same thing as just reusing a solution. It's more like saying the shape exists because reality is fighting you, which leads to the next question: what are the forces we're talking about here? And that's where we come to the real engine of the situation, which happens to be the famous book. In 1994, 4 authors published the book that turned patterns into software scripture. We call these 4 people the Gang of 4, and we call the book Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software. 23 patterns. There's creational, there's structural, and there's behavioral. This book did not just document ideas, but it did something way more powerful, and that is it standardized the names: factory, observer, strategy, decorator, visitor, and more. The naming is how reality becomes portable. Once different people on a team have and understand these names, they can communicate faster and more accurately. That's a good thing. But the bad part is really subtle, because once a pattern has a sacred title and is lifted up in the minds of so many developers, people start reaching for it just by habit. And then as junior devs come into the industry, they hear people talking about these design patterns and they start reaching for it too, like it's the next level to up their game. Not because forces always demand it, but because it feels correct. It feels safe, like we can rely on something to support structure that becomes complex. And that's when patterns stop becoming tools and instead become identity, which when somebody takes on identity and ties these concepts to it, this triggers the next terrifying question. If patterns are so foundational, why do they sometimes just vanish? This is where we arrive at the line that should permanently change your relationship with best practices. In 1996, Peter Norvig published a slide deck with a claim that sounds impossible until you stare at it long enough. 16 of the 23 classic Gang of Four design patterns are invisible or simpler, in languages like Dylan or Lisp. Not useless, not wrong, invisible. That word is not an insult, it's a real diagnosis, because Norvig's point is horrifyingly mechanical. Many patterns exist because the language can't express the idea directly. So we build structure to simulate what we wish the language could say. And Norvig doesn't just claim it, he lists why. First-class functions make patterns like strategy and command simpler. Macros make some patterns completely evaporate. Multi-methods, modules, dynamic types collapse entire structures, which means patterns aren't purely eternal wisdom. They're often prosthetics. They're scaffolding. They're just how engineers survive the constraints. And now we're holding a very dangerous truth here, which is a design pattern might just be a missing language feature wearing a tuxedo. So now we're forced into the deepest question. If patterns can be missing language features, then what happens when language features evolve? The uncomfortable answer here is patterns are fossils of constraints. But some patterns were invented because the world was different. Languages did lack features, compilers were weaker, systems were slower, and the teams needed common shapes that were teachable. So engineers did what engineers always do. They built structure to control chaos, and then they wrote it down. The structures gained authority, and then the authority outlived the original reason. The pattern remains, but the constraint is gone. So the structure stays and just becomes bureaucracy. So next time you go through a PR maze on Friday at 4:47, it hurts because someone left scaffolding inside the building after construction ended. And now you're navigating leftover scaffolding instead of the real structure, which brings us to the point where the whole subject suddenly snaps into focus. What is a design pattern really? It's not a rule that you obey. It's not a structure you worship or a diagram you memorize. A design pattern, when you really come down to it, is a named strategy for resolving recurring forces under a specific set of constraints. The constraints matter more than the strategy, because when constraints change, patterns change, they simplify, they vanish, they invert. And if you do not track that constraint, you start building solutions for problems that no longer exist, which is how best practices seem right, but at the core become haunted. Patterns are not about code, they're about communication. There's just one more layer people often miss. Humans have limited memory, and so patterns exist. A pattern name is a compression algorithm for discussion. Just one way to look at it. When we say, let's use the observer here, it can be faster than 5 paragraphs of explaining what an observer really is. People wanted a shared language. So patterns are simultaneously engineering tools, social tools, and teaching tools. This is why they're so sticky even when they're wrong. So if you really want some power here, not anti-patterns, not pattern worship, but clarity, the question you may want to ask yourself is, what constraint is this pattern solving? Because that single question prevents us from making terrible mistakes like using a pattern as just a ritual or rejecting a pattern as a meme. It forces reality back into the conversation. It makes you question which patterns are truly forces of reality, like architectural forces, which patterns are just language prosthetics, which patterns are organizational copying mechanics, which feel like paperwork that just learned how to talk. That's where the real story begins. Because once you understand patterns like this, you stop asking, should we use a factory? And you start asking the real question, which actually matters, what are we afraid of that made us build this? And once you see that, you cannot unsee it.